Hello, my name is Jennifer Shepard. My group will be presenting on ableism and lookism, and I will be discussing the history and heritage of ableism. So, what is ableism and lookism? Ableism is society's negative attitude and prejudice towards disabled people. It is the belief that able bodied people are somehow superior to those with disabilities. And lookism is discrimination based on appearance. It reinforces inequalities and social hierarchies, which can create unequal social value and limit access to opportunities. Ableism is rooted in the eugenics movement. Eugenics is a movement that came about during the late 1800s, and it regarded individuals with disabilities as unfit. It excluded them, excluded them, institutionalized them, and caused them to be harmed through systemic practices. These ideas were reinforced through policies and cultural beliefs that defined human worth based on productivity and ability. Lookism is rooted in socially constructed beauty standards. These standards were typically set by gender and culture. These standards include youthfulness, slimness, skin texture. Widows discussed how appearance norms related to these things govern expectations of women's appearance. She further noted that these norms function as ethical ideas that exert pressure on both women and men, regardless of whether they consciously endorse them or not. And although these norms have evolved over time, they still continue to shape how people are judged and valued in society. These attitudes have been shaped over time by power, by culture, and societal norms. Cultural norms surrounding ableism and lookism shape how individuals experience identity and discrimination. Intersectionality increases marginalization, and these appearance norms often place unequal burdens on marginalized groups, reinforcing systemic inequality. Stigma, including labeling and stereotyping, can negatively impact identity, self-esteem, and willingness to seek support. Techniques and best practices. Utilizing a strengths-based, person-centered approach is best to combat ableism and lookism. Applying the social model of disability to reduce barriers. The social model of disability emphasizes that barriers in society, not just the individual, create disability. We want to promote inclusiveness and create accessible environments. We want to address stigma and pathologizing language. Utilizing best practice requires challenging assumptions, addressing stigma, and promoting inclusive environments that support full participation. And advocacy is essential to address systemic inequities and promote equity across systems. Applying an ADEI lens to ableism and lookism. An ADEI lens is essential because ableism and lookism are embedded within systems, policies, and institutional norms. Applying this framework helps challenge these systems, it centers lived experiences, and it promotes equity, inclusion, and social justice.
Ableism in healthcare. So, ableism refers to the discrimination, whether it's physical, cognitive, or mental. And according to the CDC, about 1 in 4 people that live in the United States live with a disability, which makes this a really important issue in healthcare. Um, the social model of disability is the theory that I chose, which explains basically how ableism is focusing on those societal barriers instead of only the disability itself. This model does suggest that the disability is shaped by environmental, social, economic, and these systemic barriers are limiting participation and accessibility. So examples can include, not having the correct access to these healthcare environments that they need, communication barriers, and just having negative attitudes from their healthcare providers. Healthcare disparities. So, in relation to ableism, individuals that have disabilities experience significant healthcare disparities. And the research does show that more often than not, they have reduced access to preventative care. And this creates higher rates of unmet health care, which is, overall not good for our healthcare system for those that have these issues. So these disparities are showing that our healthcare system, we still have these large gaps when it comes to equitable care. Practice challenges. Practice challenges with ableism in healthcare settings specifically. They may experience bias, they'll experience stigma, and this will affect the quality of care that they do receive. Some individuals may also experience reduced autonomy, which in healthcare decision making is huge because now they're faced with these system level barriers that make it more difficult for them to access quality care. And over time, these negative experiences will contribute to them having such mistrust within our healthcare system. Best practices. So, ableism in healthcare, I would say one important best practice would be person-centered care. This focuses on the individual's specific needs, what their preferences are, their experiences, and creating accessible environments and using the communication devices that one may need really does help improve healthcare access and their outcomes. This could include things like adaptive devices, accessible spaces, and just allowing the person to be a part of their treatment planning. And through my work at my mental health residential, I've seen firsthand how having a supportive environment and, having an individualized environment really helps our residents feel more comfortable, respected, and just like involved in their own care. And the big thing that we like to say is like the driver in their own seat. And it really does make a huge difference when it comes to their overall care experience. Using an ADI lens when it comes to ableism does help improve experience for individuals that have disabilities. So equity includes providing appropriate accommodations, while inclusion will support any participation in their care planning. So reducing those systemic barriers can improve the access to quality healthcare and overall lead to better health outcomes. An ADI approach also encourages the providers themselves to recognize those differences and experiences and avoid treating all individuals with disabilities the same. Lookism in healthcare. So, lookism refers to the discrimination based on one's physical appearance. So, it could be anything like their weight or any kind of visible difference. And the theory that I use is stigma theory. So, this helps explain how perceived differences can lead to the bias and unequal treatment. And the research does show that appearance can influence how individuals are perceived, how they're treated, including within these healthcare settings specifically. Healthcare disparities. So the research is showing that the weight, stigma, and appearance, bias can negatively impact one's experience in healthcare. Appearance bias can influence clinical judgment, and which this can also affect the way that the interactions are in healthcare between provider and patient, which can contribute to the disparities in care and overall treatment qualities. So some individuals may feel uncomfortable seeking the medical care that they need because they're feared based on their how somebody's going to judge them based on their appearance, their physical appearance. Um, yeah. So practice challenges when it comes to lookism in healthcare. So individuals experiencing lookism may report negative healthcare experiences due to the bias and stigma that they're experiencing. So appearance-related stigma can impact their emotional well-being. It can impact also, the type of care that they're receiving from their providers. They can also create additional barriers to treatment, which is ultimately going to negatively affect, their both their physical and their mental outcomes over time. Best practices for lookism in healthcare. So, to address lookism in healthcare, providers should focus on reducing those bias and stigma that we just discussed and using respectful communication, avoiding any assumption about patients, increasing the awareness of appearance-based bias can help strengthen the patient-provider relationship and improve that care quality. And providers should also focus on treating the individuals holistically instead of, making judgment based on their appearance alone. ADEI and lookism. So applying an ADI lens to lookism, it's going to promote fairness and inclusion within the healthcare setting and reducing the appearance-based stigma and addressing the bias can improve patient experience. It can improve their engagement in their own care, which is going to improve overall health outcomes. And this approach also is going to encourage providers to feel like they can create more of a supportive space in their offices, in their environments, where individuals can, feel like people are listening and they feel included. They feel like the driver is in their own seat when it comes to their care. So overall, both ableism and lookism both show how the bias and how any systemic barriers are impacting healthcare experiences for those that have these disabilities. And using theory, best practices, and ADI lens, this is going to help providers create more equitable, more inclusive care environments while improving the trust and patient outcomes.
Hello. So today I would like to talk to you about assimilation and acculturation. I want to ground you in the idea of assimilation. So assimilation happens when individuals feel pressure to adopt the dominant culture's norms, often at the expense of their own cultural identity. This can describe how stigma and social comparison shape this process, and people start to measure themselves against what society labels as normal or acceptable. So, for individuals who experience ableism or lookism, this pressure becomes even more intense. Their body's communication styles or ways of navigating becomes less about belonging and more about survival. So, social theory shows us that norms around appearance, ability, and behavior reinforce these systems, pushing people to fit in rather than be themselves. Assimilation isn't neutral, it's shaped by power, privilege, and the expectation to conform. Acculturation versus identity. So, acculturation, on the other hand, is a different process. Acculturation is about adapting to a new cultural environment while still maintaining aspects of your original identity. It's a balancing act. learning new norms without erasing who you are. But this becomes complicated in systems where whiteness or able-bodiedness are treated as the default. For example, an immigrant deaf student entering a school system is navigating multiple layers of expectation. You have language, culture, disability norms, and racialized assumptions. They're not just adjusting to a new environment, they're adjusting to an environment that already defines what normal should look like. That tension between identity and expectations shapes their well-being and their sense of belonging. The theoretical frameworks. So to understand these dynamics more deeply, we can look at two theoretical frameworks. We have the stigma theory, which explains how individuals get marked as deviant from societal standards. There's enacted stigma, which is the discrimination people face externally, and felt stigma, which is the internalized shame that develops.
Fatima, I think you're muted.
Thank you. So there's enacted stigma, which is the discrimination people face externally, and felt stigma, which is in the internalized shame that develops over time. This framework helps us see how ableism and lookism show up in everyday interactions, not just in policies, but in subtle social cues, expectations, and judgments. So the second is ratio-linguistic theory, which explores how language and race work together to create social hierarchies. It also extends to appearance, how certain bodies become racialized or judged. Language becomes a tool that either legitimizes or delegitimizes someone's identity. It determines whose communication is seen as intelligent, professional, or acceptable, and whose is dismissed. These frameworks help us understand why assimilation pressure is not evenly distributed. So techniques and best practices. When we think about reducing assimilation pressure, one of the most important steps is normalizing diverse communication, styles, ASL accents, multilingualism, and different ways of expressing identity. These should be seen as assets, not deficits. We also need policies that actively remove ableist assumptions in schools, workplaces, and community settings. For acculturation, supporting open help seeking is essential is essential. Many international students experience internalized shame during cultural adjustment, and creating environments where asking for help is normalized can make a huge difference. Investing in culturally responsive support services helps people feel seen and valued. When institutions normalize diverse identities, people are more willing to engage without feeling like they must hide parts of themselves. So challenges with acculturation. Acculturation also comes with real challenges. People often experience identity conflict, trying to honor their heritage while adapting to dominant norms. Marginalized groups face additional barriers because stigma and ableism shape how they're perceived and treated. Language discrimination is a major issue. Racial-linguistic bias disproportionately affects deaf students of color who face both racial and linguistic exclusion. Many individuals also lose their cultural support systems, which increases stress and isolation. And often institutions expect assimilation rather than true acculturation. This mismatch places the burden on individuals instead of addressing systemic barriers. It's not that people are failing to adapt, it's that systems are failing to accommodate. So, best practices, ADI, ADEI. This brings us to ADEI best practices. Creating disability inclusive environments means designing spaces that don't force people to fit dominant norms. We need to recognize and value multiple cultural identities rather than expecting people to conform to a single standard. Equity audits can help identify when racial-linguistic discrimination and other biases show up in systems. And ultimately, the goal is integration, not assimilation, creating environments where people can belong without erasing who they are. When institutions shift from fit in to you belong as you are, we create spaces that support authentic participation, reduce stigma, and honor the full complexity of people's identities. That's the heart of ADEI work, building systems that adapt to people, not the other way around.
Okay. Ableism and lookism, gender roles and relationships. Exploring how appearance-based and ability-based discrimination shape gender dynamics, relationships, and family life. I think you went too far. The definition of ableism is discrimination towards a person based on actual or perceived disability. Definition of lookism is discrimination based on physical appearance or attractiveness. Ableism and gender roles. Ableism prejudice varies by gender. For example, disabled women are penalized more harshly than disabled men. Next slide. Okay. Lookism and gender roles. Men experience lookism from direct exposure without the relational chain of mistreatment, suggesting gender shapes how lookism is experienced. Intimate relationships, family, and disability. Women with physical disabilities face societal stigma and negative self-concept as care barriers to forming relationships and intimate situations. Client-side challenges. Internalized ableism, an example of client-side challenges. Internalism and lookism. Clients may accept societal judgments about their worth in relationships. Cross-cultural barriers. Some cultures hold rigid gender norms where disability is seen as a disqualifying for partnership or parenting roles. Structural barriers. Lookism lacks the same legal protection as race, sex, or disability discrimination in most jurisdictions. Best practices, techniques in the ADEI lens. Best practices and techniques are anti-lookism workplace advocacy, supporting clients in documenting appearance-based mistreatment and accessing resources. Working through the ADEI lens. A way you can work through the ADEI lens is with diversity, and you can recognize that ableism manifests differently by gender and disability types, and you can tailor interventions accordingly.
Up next, we will discuss the prejudice, discrimination, and oppression surrounding ableism and lookism. Okay, when we look at the biases surrounding ableism and lookism, we have to look beyond the definitions. Both forms of biases can shape how people are treated before they have the opportunity to actually make an impression. With ableism, people may assume that someone with a disability is less capable, needs too much support, or they cannot participate in the same way as others. When we look at bias as it refers to lookism, it may look like an individual's judging another person's value, their professionalism, or their ability to perform simply based on how they look. These biases can directly affect opportunities. A person may be overlooked for employment or excluded from certain spaces, which can in turn make them feel as though they do not belong. It's also important to note the issue is not always the disability or the person's appearance itself. A lot of times the barrier for these individuals comes from the assumptions and the stereotypes attached to the disability or the appearance. So when we talk about ableism and lookism, we're not just talking about what someone thinks of their opinions. We're talking about how those thoughts can become patterns of bias and discrimination that affect how people are treated, what opportunities they receive, and how these barriers affect their everyday lives. I've experienced a real life example of ableism very recently, which connects directly to ableism in practice. So there was a colleague of mine who was a licensed therapist. I'm a behavioral assistant. We usually accept cases together. We received a referral for a youth who needed support with emotional regulation, anxiety, and social isolation. The referral also noted that the youth was deaf and that there would have been an interpreter present during all sessions. So we knew right up front that there was going to be someone there to interpret, but this was something that was new to us. While I accepted the case, she informed me that she was declining the case. So upon us having speaking, she stated that she was declining not because of the presenting concerns, but because the youth was deaf. She stated that she felt unqualified to work with a youth with this disability, and she felt unqualified to work with an interpreter during sessions. So this really stood out to me, especially since we're currently learning and working about ableism and lookism. This particular therapist has tremendous experience when working with youth who have had these same behavioral and emotional needs that were listed in this particular referral. So I mentioned this to her, and she stated that she just does not feel qualified to work with an interpreter or a deaf child, and that she feels like this field is a specialized field where the person should be qualified to do so. So in this particular case, the needs to be addressed were anxiety, emotional regulation, which were well within her scope. So her hesitation wasn't based on the clinical concerns, but more on the disability itself and the use of accommodations. According to research on ableism in the Journal of Occupational Rehabilitation by Sally Lindsay, individuals with disabilities often face barriers, not because of their actual needs, but because of assumptions about what others believe they can or cannot do. In this situation, the interpreter was there to support the youth to eliminate any communication barriers, but instead of an accommodation, but instead this particular accommodation became the reason for the youth being denied care. I wanted to use this example to reflect on how bias can show up in unintentional ways. It was so ironic that this came up while I was working on this presentation, but this example really highlights how there's a difference between recognizing a need for specialized training and making assumptions based on a person's disability. Ableism and lookism can impact individual access to opportunities. First, as I mentioned in my example, the youth was denied appropriate care due to assumptions based surrounding his disability. According to Lindsay and colleagues, ableism creates barriers often to prevent individuals with disabilities from various employment opportunities as well. These biases further reinforce inequality. Research shows that people with disabilities are often underemployed, or they experience discrimination in the workplace. Second, these biases reinforce inequality and social exclusion, as these experiences impact a person's financial stability and their quality of life. Third, there is also an emotional and psychological impact that stems from this mistreatment. Experiences of discrimination can have an effect on a person's mental health. It can lead to low self-esteem, anxiety, depression, and even isolation. So in summary, these biases fuel barriers in employment, social relationships, and mental health. People who are perceived as different, whether it's due to their disability or their appearance, often face ongoing barriers that limit their opportunities over time. Lastly, I wanted to connect ableism and lookism to anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion, starting with diversity. So diversity includes differences not just about race and culture, but also in the physical appearance and abilities of individuals. According to the ADEI framework, diversity means acknowledging that these differences exist and understanding how they shape our experiences. When we talk about equity, this is about making sure that everyone has fair access to opportunities. For individuals with disabilities, like my real life example, where the interpreter was being provided for all sessions, the barrier was not the disability, and it was not that the youth would not benefit from services. The barrier was for the therapist, whom felt as though she was not qualified to work with an interpreter or a youth with that disability. Research also states that without appropriate supports in place, individuals may face barriers that limit their opportunities. It is our responsibility to make sure that services are equitable and accessible. Now we discuss lookism as it pertains to equity. There's an article titled "What's Wrong with Everyday Lookism" by Andrew Mason, and he talks about the concept called luck egalitarianism. Luck egalitarianism is an idea that people should not be advantaged or disadvantaged based on the things that are beyond their control. And when we say this, we're talking about how an individual is born or how they look. Lookism supports this concept, showing that people who are perceived as better looking or what society deems as appropriate receive more benefits. When appearance begins to determine opportunities, that creates an unfair system that directly goes against the idea of equity. And lastly, when we speak about inclusion, we're talking about more than just allowing someone to be present. Inclusion means creating an environment where people feel valued and supported. Even if the opportunities exist, without inclusion, a person may still feel excluded or overlooked if their needs are ignored and they are treated like an inconvenience. So when we look at ableism and lookism through an ADEI lens, the goal is not just to recognize that the bias exists. The goal is to remove the barriers that keep people from being fully seen, fully supported, and fully included.
So I did my presentation on education and employment in relation to ableism and lookism. So ableism is a society-created framework that unfairly disadvantages and excludes individuals with disabilities, and that's across the entire spectrum, giving people labels, stereotyping them, and making assumptions based on their abilities, based on how they look, or which disabilities they either have hidden or visual. Critical disability theory posits that disability is more than a medical condition, and it's shaped by societal attitudes, intersectionality of individual identities, and inequality in environmental access and power structures. So basically, disability is complex and it's affected by many things, not just the health condition. Lookism is the occupational segregation and the glass ceiling that are interconnected issues that highlight intersectional limitations that women specifically face in the workplace more than men, something that is known as pretty privilege and the resulting benefits of physical beauty. So women in general are facing more discrimination because of their gender as well as their appearance, and men as well, but women face it more. Also marginalized people, LGBTQ, if they also present a certain way, there's certain discrimination that they face. Both labeling theory and stereotype threat theory argue that even though there's no direct discrimination, that the outcomes can be severe for people who have these stereotypes and labels thrust thrust on them. So hidden biases and things due to unkempt appearance and leadership opportunities are kept from them based on appearance. So effects on education. So there are barriers to equitable learning. A student with a disability may be discouraged from taking advanced classes because teachers may think that they're not capable, or it'll be too much that they'll struggle with. Students with disabilities also may be less likely to use accommodations because they don't want to be judged, or they fear being treated differently by their peers or even by other teachers. And also, if teachers perceive a student as unkempt or that their appearance doesn't match the high expectations that they have, they may associate them often with lower socioeconomic status, and therefore project their own stereotypes or assumptions onto them about not being capable or not being able to fully commit to something because of their lower socioeconomic status that the teacher perceives. So effects on unemployment. So there is discrimination, underemployment, reduced pay, and social exclusions that are rampant among people with disabilities, especially the youth. So for example, some people are stuck in lower level roles despite being capable of more, simply because they may not look a certain way or they may not present a certain way, or because they have a disability and people are assuming that they can't fulfill certain roles, especially in leadership. Ableism has been likened to metaphorical violence, limiting opportunities for career growth. So some employees are often overlooked just because of the assumptions that are made about their capabilities. Barriers in the workplace, inadequate accommodations, and reticence to disclose disabilities. This actually just happened to my best friend. She sprained her ankle and she was supposed to be at a conference, and she had to use a wheelchair for the first time, and she was unable to read any signs. They hadn't put any signs that were low enough for her to read, so she had to ask constantly for people to read them to her. Also, there was a lot of hills or like uneven floors in the building, and she constantly had to ask someone to help push her because those accommodations were not in place. So that was a real eye-opening experience for her and for me listening to that. Also, the development of imposter syndrome and low self-confidence in the response to lookism in the workplace. So lack of self-confidence is very common, and it leads to the imposter syndrome when people are judged based on only their looks or their disability. So best practices in ableism and lookism. So recognizing and addressing discrimination at work through multi-level intervention, including accountability frameworks and formal conflict resolution processes to promote inclusivity and career opportunities for both men and women. And that includes anti-discrimination policies, transparent promotion processes, and then implementing public policies and practices that prioritize inclusion and equality for those with a disability, both at work and in the school. That would be having reasonable accommodations, supporting employees based on, not discriminating against people with disabilities or that are not presenting themselves a certain way. Also, training academic educators to be aware of their own biased perceptions of students' academic competence and intelligence based on physical appearance and assumed socioeconomic status. So training hiring managers and teachers just to be aware of that bias that may be implicit, and just recognizing that so that they don't project any assumptions onto students or colleagues. So using an ADEI lens is important because instead of emphasizing perceived limitations, we should recognize and appreciate the unique insights and contributions that people with disabilities offer. So Having teachers recognize abilities and potential instead of just basing off of appearance, and actually evaluating people based on their skills and performance and their qualifications. In education, professional development that helps teachers address those unconscious biases, and teaching managers also, or providing them with bias training so that they don't also reflect their own biases onto their workers. And then some scholars contend that disability has been significantly overlooked in conversations about equity. It is important to include people that are within that community. So actively seeking input from employees with disabilities or from students that have disabilities, or also for people who don't present certain ways, especially marginalized people, and really getting their input and putting that into practice. And that is the end of our presentation. Thank you so much.